Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Probably any time that I'm around a thunderstorm, someone will say something to me like, oh, well, Thor is working hard up there right now. Just because people know that I have a professional background in Norse language and mythology. But it is an interesting fact that while Thor, as god of thunder, is pretty much filed away in exactly those words in most of our minds today, he is never called anything like god of thunder in our surviving Old Norse sources. And in fact, all of these titles that we use today, so and so is goddess of love, so and so is god of war, so and so is god of the sea, all of these titles are modern inventions and don't reflect categorizations that we see in our surviving Old Norse texts. So, I want to talk a little bit about that today and about the way that these labels can be slightly useful in marginal cases, but for the most part, probably damage our understanding of these medieval myths. So, to begin with, I'm guilty of this too, right? Like everyone, I grew up in the 20th or 21st century, and my first encounters with Norse mythology, which were admittedly not very many before I began studying this seriously, but which, took the form of the popular handbook Mythology by Edith Hamilton, which has a short appendix about Norse myth, and also took the form of paper and dice RPG supplements, deities and demigods, or as the deep cut one that I'm actually familiar with, Pantheons of the Megaverse from Rifts. Uh, and from these, I absorbed the typical, okay, god of thunder, that's Thor, goddess of love, that's Freya or Frigg for, sources that confound them or don't separate them. Um, and in my first edition of my translation of the Poetic Edda, I am pretty sure, in fact, I remember at least some examples in the glossary and introduction of that work where I would call someone god of this or goddess of that, right? Njordur is god of the sea, or Thor is god of thunder, or whatever. And although I extensively reworked the second edition, and that is coming out now in September 2025, it is even possible that I am so used to seeing those things that it washed over me a couple times, and I left some of that in the glossary or introduction without thinking about it. I don't know. I don't use find and replace in editing. I'm always using my own eyes. I find that that's usually better, but of course one can miss things that way too. Now, it might not seem, dangerous in a way to think about the gods uh, by titles and classifications, right? What's wrong, as it were, with saying, well, Thor is god of thunder? And of course, I don't think that there will ever be negative repercussions in your daily life for this, but I think that it does limit us in understanding our actual sources. Because let's think about where Thor shows up in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. He's there in Voluspa, the very first poem in the Poetic Edda, where we read about an early conflict the gods have, where Thor alone is in a mood to fight. He always wants to fight when oaths are broken. We hear about him fighting and killing and being killed by Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent. In Horbarsljóð, probably a late poem, probably not pre-Christian like most of the poems about the gods are, but probably based on some material from pre-Christian times. Thor and Odin insult each other. Thunder and lightning also don't come up in this poem, just as they don't in Völuspá. Instead, we see Odin steadily associating Thor with a lower class. You know, Odin is saying that he's the higher class god, and Thor is the god of slaves and peasants. And Thor is constantly talking about his hard work to protect our realm, Midgardr, and the realm of the gods, Ósgardr, from our cosmic enemies, the Jotuns. Nothing to do with thunder and lightning. In the poem Humiskvida, Thor goes fishing for Jormungandr, nothing to do with lightning and thunder. In the poem Lokasenna, Loki insults all the gods until Thor comes home, and Loki insults him a little bit. He says, "Oh, you hid in a glove," a story that I've talked about in other videos, and which a rare poetic version of which is included in the second edition of the Poetic Edda, but nothing to do with thunder and lightning. In the poem Thrymskvida, Thor dresses up as a bride to go get his hammer Mjolnir, which has been stolen by a Jotun. Nothing to do with thunder and lightning. And in the poem Alvismál, Thor prevents a dwarf from marrying his daughter by keeping him talking for a long time until the dwarf turns to stone when he's struck by sunlight. Nothing to do with thunder and lightning. In the Prose Edda, as much as Snorri Sturluson is trying to educate us about the gods in a way that will make sense to his very Christian and, by a few hundred years more modern audience in the Prose Edda, he never calls Thor a god of thunder. I don't think mentions thunder or lightning in connection with him in Gylfaginning, the first part of the Prose Edda, which is what people mostly read. And then the one association that we get of Thor with thunder and lightning in a story is in Skóldskaparmál, the second part of the Prose Edda, where Snorri has him show up for the fight with Hrungnir, accompanied by thunder and lightning. So, if we call him God of Thunder, we are, simplifying him. We're giving him some kind of label, some kind of handle to grab him by in our minds. But it doesn't have a lot to do with the stories in which he actually appears, right? It's if I were to list the top things that come to mind about Thor, none of them, from our original sources, none of them would have anything to do with thunder and lightning. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is in September and October 2025, I am once again offering Zoom classes. You can take Intro to Runic Studies, which is an academically oriented course on the history of the runic alphabets and their diversity of form. So we will be learning pretty much everything that you need to know to start really seriously researching runes and following current journals and research about runes. There will also be a more creatively oriented class called Reading and Writing Runes that I'll do on Zoom in January and February 2026, so watch out for announcements about that. You can also join my in-progress Norse mythology classes. We still need to read the heroic poems of the Poetic Edda in detail, and my in-progress Old Norse reading club, in which we are about a third of the way through reading the saga of Gisli Sorsson in its entirety. So check those out on Eventbrite if you're interested. And now back to your regularly scheduled program. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is he has a hammer called Mjolnir, and he fights Jotuns with it. Maybe he fights Jotuns all the time, really should be its own fact, number 2. Number 3, he has sons, Mothi and Magni, who are stronger than he is. Number 4, he has 2 goats that he drives, who pull him around. Number 5, he's often accompanied by Loki on his weird little expeditions. Number 6, he's married to Siv, who has golden hair. Number 7, he's the son of Odin, and he's a more everyday and less selfish figure than Odin is. Number 8, he has red hair and a red beard, which is a hair color associated more with the middle class. Number 9, he will kill and be killed by Midgard's Ormur, Jormungandr at Ragnarok. So those are just some of the first things that come to mind from actual stories, right? None of that is encapsulated by calling him God of Thunder. So I just think that it's an oversimplification in the wrong direction, right? It takes something that's not important, if it even is something that would have made sense to a pre-Christian Norse pagan, and makes it the central thing that we're identifying him by, right? It's like, I guess part of this is just sort of a frustration with us identifying um, things by things that aren't important to the actual identification of that thing. Um, Colorado, beginning in the early 21st century, uh, people began to associate it with marijuana because, it was legalized here before it was legalized anywhere else. Um, I've never used it in my life. Sure, plenty of people do, but it's like, how is that, something that's not a part of my life at all? Why does that define my state? How about the state with the mountains, right? Which I guess is the second thing that comes to mind, but marijuana being the first thing that comes to mind is sort of frustrating. Or you sometimes see this with, if you're a birder, it's like, why is this bird distinct from that bird when they look the same? But then these two birds that look really different are considered the same, and sometimes that actually, there's scientific reasons for these population distinctions. All these dark-eyed juncos are the same species, or um, Rufus hummingbird and Allen's hummingbird are a different species. But at least from our naked eyes point of view, it's like, why are we focusing on these things that don't seem important? And that's my reaction to calling the gods and goddesses of Norse myth god of or goddess of whatever. I also think that there are some disagreements that come up here that are sort of useless disagreements that don't cast any light on anything. And one of the main disagreements like that is, well, who is God of War? Because I'm certainly on record, although I don't like these god of and goddess of titles. Again, I used to use them reflexively like everyone does. So I'm on record calling Odin God of War. Okay, that makes sense to me. I mean, if you're going to call anybody God of War, if you have to pick a god of Norse myth, I think Odin makes sense. He's the one who fosters war. He wants human beings to fight. He may not really participate in war other than the very first one and the very last one, but he certainly stirs it up, and his Valkyries select the greatest human warriors to join him in Valhalla, where they continue to practice the arts of war. But there is a somewhat persistent identification of Tyr, the one-handed god, as god of war in some quarters. And I think that's influenced by Snorri in the Prose Edda may call him, when he's introducing all the gods, he tries to come up with some handle to grab them by. And I think, one-handed god for Tyr is a pretty good one, but I think he also calls him, the best fighter or something like that. Although I think he calls everybody the best fighter. Probably the fact that in the names of the days of the week, he's identified with Mars, right? French Maldi, from Latin Martis Dies, the day of Mars, becomes Tuesday, when the equivalent Germanic gods are identified with the Roman gods who originally named the days of the week. And I think sometimes too much is made of those identifications. Whoever thought that, Mars Day, the equivalent, was Tyr's Day, we don't know what they were seizing on for that, right? We don't know what particular feature of Tyr made them think of some particular feature of Mars. It might have been that in the much earlier century, when those identifications were made, that Tyr had more of a war god-like function than he has in the Eddas. But that doesn't shed any light on his function in the Eddas, because it's really not his function in the Eddas. In the Eddas, what does Tyr do? Well, he shows up in the Poetic Edda, getting insulted by Loki and Lokasena for having one hand. And Loki also says that he slept with Tyr's wife. We don't even know who she is. And then in the Prose Edda, of course, we hear the story of how he lost his hand by putting it in the mouth of Fenrir. None of that sounds like classic, war god to me, if the title is going to mean anything. So if the title is going to mean anything, I think it would have to mean Odin, but then I don't really think that the title means that much, right? I don't think that pre-Christian Norse pagans thought about their gods in terms of these functions, these deities and demigods, god of this, goddess of that functions. I might, of course, reach for one god for a particular prayer or request because it's for something that's kind of in their domain. And I think there we maybe get a little bit closer to functions, your god of war, goddess of love type things. I mean, Freya does seem to be identified with love. Again, but does goddess of love really tell you anything about what she does in the Eddas, right? When she shows up? Odin with war, Njordur with the sea and with travel, sure. So, I mean, in some loose way, I don't think that it's, the most incredibly wrong thing in the world to say that Freya is a goddess of love or Njordur is a god of the sea. But it doesn't tell you anything about, it doesn't even tell you about what you hear about Freya or Njordur in Lokasena when Loki's insulting them. And you would think that if, the sea were such a big deal in identifying and interpreting the character of Njordur, that we would hear more about it when Loki is, reaching for things to insult him about, and not that Hymir's daughters urinated in his mouth, whatever that's about. That's a real thing from Lokasena. These functions just don't, it's just not elucidating, right? Hey folks, we'll be back to your regular presentation in a moment, but for right now, I'm here at Grimfrost World Headquarters Longhouse with Johan Hegg, and I just want to remind you that if you have Viking needs, you have a Viking supplier. Grimfrost really cares about getting things right, and if you need replica, well, anything, right? Shields, helmets, weapons, board games, cool t-shirts, hats, all sorts of accessories like that. You can get them at grimfrost.com together with my books, and they ship just about anywhere in the world. So check them out. It does help support the channel. Right, and then sometimes it's just flat out wrong. Going back to, that Dungeons & Dragons book, Deities and Demigods, starting then, although going all the way back to, I think, Jakob Grimm, Loki has been identified as a god of fire, and you see him identified as a god of fire all over modern media. But he has no functions in common with fire. I don't think he ever does anything with fire, and his name doesn't mean anything to do with fire. And the one time that I can really think of him being associated with fire, he's defeated by fire because he has an eating contest with Logi, which means flame. It only coincidentally looks like his name. So how is he a god of fire at all? If there's a god of fire, it would really be more like a demon or anti-god of fire. It would be Surtur, who brings the flames that burn the world at Ragnarok. So, and that brings us to another point where sometimes I think we overemphasize the meanings of God's names in trying to assign these functions. And again, assigning the functions doesn't tell us much. So Thor's name does mean thunder. And that's interesting information, right? I would rather know that than not know that. And as a linguist, I'm always happy to know the meanings of words. But I think that we can be misled, not by linguistics per se, right? I'm not going to open that can of worms because I don't believe it anyway. But I think we can be misled by looking at the meaning of a name when the meaning of the name is never called attention to, right? So, throughout the sagas, we find human beings who have meaningful names, but their names don't seem to mean anything to the story. Just to start dragging some examples out, I'm going to try to drag some out that don't have Thor in them, because a lot of them do. Ravenkel, raven helmet. It's composed out of two elements that are common in Norse names: predatory animals, Raven, raven, and equipment for war, Kel, helmet. from Ketil, sort of a joking word for helmet. But it's not as if this character ever uses a raven helmet, right? He's not particularly raven associated, or particularly associated with the god who's associated with ravens, Odin, because in fact Hrafnkel is a priest of Freyr. Or think about a character named Gunnar, right? Another common name. This is like battle warrior, right? Again, it's not necessarily meaningful except to have elements that are important to the culture. Again, martial elements. Same thing with women's names, Hildegunnar, battle. That's not necessarily the name of a warlike woman. Or Gudrun, the battle rune, or possibly battle companion is actually a better translation of rune in women's names. Again, not necessarily a woman associated with war in any particular way. It's just a name. So Thor is named Thunder. And in fact, the word is the same as the English word thunder. These both go back to Proto-Germanic thunras. If you look at English Thursday, that is from the Old English form of this name, Thursday, the day of thunder, day of Thor. In Old Icelandic, it was Thors dagar, day of Thor, and Thor, the Scandinavian form we're used to seeing. I'm sure that he was once very associated with thunder. In fact, it's quite possible that his weapon was originally literally lightning, if Mjolnir is related, as seems pretty likely, to Russian Molnia, the lightning. Not a native speaker or even a competent speaker of Russian, so don't judge me on that pronunciation, please. But again, it doesn't help us understand him in our written sources about him, our stories about him. It conflates maybe a much earlier Thor that we know nothing about, right? We have no written stories about him from a time when he was strongly associated with thunder, with a god that we can understand to a certain extent, the god of the Eddas, right? I have a pretty comprehensive idea of what it would be like to sit down with Thor on this porch and watch the thunder rolling in. I don't have a good idea of what his powers over thunder or lightning would be, right? I have a sense of him as a character, as a personality, because that's what comes out in these stories. I don't have a sense of his character sheet. I don't have a sense of what specific, abilities, he can cause 6d6 damage with his lightning or something like that, right? That's just never specified. And the different powers that gods have in different stories seem to be governed not by some kind of objective list or a truly specific, agreed upon set of characteristics or abilities or powers, but just what's needed for the story. In fact, their size seems to go up and down depending on things in a story. Sometimes you get the impression that the gods and the Jotuns, which are the same size as each other, are immense compared to human beings, but then sometimes they're among human beings and are the same size as us. Myth is full of that sort of dream logic. And while we might have consistent characters in our dreams, I don't think that they have consistent attributes, to use another kind of gaming term. And I don't think that they necessarily have a lot of continuity from one story to another. Right, in some ways, I think that probably the best analogy for these characters is something more like James Bond, or like a comic book character, right? James Bond is the same character in every story, right? I mean, we can kind of expect certain things he's going to do. We understand his personality, right? He's going to drive a fast car. He's going to, somehow sleep with someone new. He is going to shoot someone with a Walther PPK, but I don't necessarily know James Bond's attributes, right? I couldn't tell you what his strength attribute is, how much he could deadlift. And I think that Thor is very much the same, right? I have a sense of what he will do in interacting with other characters in the story. I don't necessarily have a sense of his ability to, specifically physically manipulate lightning and thunder, and I'm not sure that that was anyone's notion of him by the time that the poems of the Poetic Edda were orally composed, probably in the 900s AD. Well, I hope that that's made some sense, another one of these somewhat discursive surgery recovery videos on the porch for you. And I hope that if you're intrigued by the notion of reading more of our original medieval sources about Norse mythology, that you'll consider reading the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda in my translation. The Prose Edda translation is still forthcoming from Hackett Publishing Company. But in the middle of September 2025, my second edition, or the second edition of my translation of the Poetic Edda, will be published. This is extensively revised with reference to the original Old Norse text. It has been added to with new poems from outside of the Poetic Edda proper that tell us something about Norse mythology. And there is a lot of beautiful new art, including, oddly enough, a map drawn by me, family trees, a lot of authentic runic decoration, and just some beautiful touches throughout by Liz Wilson, editorial director at Hackett Publishing Company. So check that out. I hope you will in the coming month. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, thanking you and wishing you all the best.